Welcome everyone. We're going to give it a couple minutes. You guys are our favorite early bird special people. We're going to give it a few minutes to give some other people a chance to come find us. Righty. Because I can't stand an awkward silence, I'm going to keep going, my friends. Wow. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. It is freezing out, so I've never been more excited to do a virtual program in my life. This is very exciting. I don't want to have you guys wait too much, so I'm going to start kicking it off. Welcome to the National Park Service Presents. It is a wonderful Tuesday evening tonight. Like I said, it's chilly, but we're virtual. This is a program that we partner with the National Park Service that usually takes place in the branches. If you are familiar with them, they've been, around. But we decided to switch it to a virtual setting because, COVID, not just us, but everyone. And this is a program that runs every other Tuesday evening starting at 6. And this particular series will end on April 27th. Even though this series will cover a multitude of topics, you'll notice the BPL's overall programming theme of repairing America kind of weaving its way throughout all the presentations. But before we begin, I do want everyone to know that we are recording. You guys demanded and we gave it to you. So we are now recording this wonderful program. This is the second one we're recording. So if you would like to have a copy of it or share it with other people, you can always email ask@bpl.org. That's ask@bpl.org, and we can send you the link. We will eventually try and put it up somewhere, maybe on our YouTube page, but slow and steady, we're getting there. If you do notice, the captions are on this amazing program. If you enjoy them, keep them on. If you don't, you can turn them off individually. You just, on the bottom right, there's the CC, and you can hit hide captions, so you can individually turn them off if you'd like. And the last but not least, the chat. All right, so we highly encourage you asking questions throughout the program. Our wonderful Ranger Katie is going to give her wonderful presentation, and then we're going to answer questions at the very, very end. But you shouldn't have to wait until then, so feel free to click into the chat and make sure you notice the to form. All right, it says to, and it can go to all panelists, but you would like to go to all panelists or attendees if you'd like. And then you can share and chat with friends or ask questions throughout. And Sean, our wonderful moderator, will pop in and he will get all of your questions. And then trying to think. I think that's all I have for you right now. So without crazy babbling from me anymore, please welcome Ranger Katie. She's presenting our first presentation of Women's History Month. It's called The Women's Era Club, a story of Black women's activism. Take it away, Katie.
Thank you very much. First things first, let me just share my screen and make sure you all can see it. Okay, everyone can see that? Perfect, great. Thank you all for coming. Glad that you're here. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Massachusetts tribe, the tribe of the indigenous peoples from whom the colony, province, and Commonwealth of Massachusetts have taken their name. I would like to pay my respect to the ancestral bloodline of the Massachusetts tribe and their descendants who still inhabit historical Massachusetts tribe territories to this day. I also acknowledge my privileged identity and position as a white woman sharing these stories of Black women. I recognize that I will never fully understand the experiences of these women who keenly felt their dual status as women and as African Americans. I admire their tenacity, their perseverance as they faced obstacles, and their ability to forge paths for themselves. Throughout this talk, I hope to serve as merely the vehicle to elevate their voices using the voices of Black contemporaries, scholars, and publications whenever possible. With this and similar programming, the National Parks of Boston hopes to highlight the diversity of the American experience throughout our history. So as we get started, I'd like to pose a couple questions to kind of get your mind thinking for you to consider. And please feel free to kind of put them in the chat. So the first kind of questions are, when you think of an activist, who do you think of? What are the first names that come to your mind? And similarly, what are the first images that come to your mind? So I encourage you all to put those in the chat, and Sean will, if you can read some of those. So kind of think about what is in this, what pops up in the textbooks, the history textbooks that you think of. Whenever you're ready, Sean.
So far we have Rosa Parks, Gandhi, Martin Luther King.
Yeah, great. So those are definitely some good, big names. And that's really what we think of. We think of, big movements, the civil rights movement, big marches. And the names that come to mind, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, Rosa Parks, those are all big names, big recognizable names. Any others, Sean, that pop up?
We have Harriet Tubman.
Great, perfect. Yeah, I mean, so those are great. Thank you all. And, I'm glad that you included some women's names because historically, men have tended to receive more recognition for their activism than women. And when we do think of Black women, the list of recognizable names even shortens even more. There are a few women who have been commonly remembered for their activism. We saw Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman, but countless Black women have been overlooked in the history of protest and activism in the United States. And I would say recently, there has been a more concerted effort to elevating and recognizing Black women for their historical contributions. And within the National Park Service, I'd say some of this has come alongside research for the centennial of the 19th Amendment and recognizing the work of Black suffragists and voting rights activists during and after the fight for the 19th Amendment. And while it's necessary and incredibly important research and that they really do deserve a place in that history, I do want to make it clear that what they fought for was much more than just the vote. So historian Martha Jones adeptly addresses this in her recently published pivotal work, Vanguard, saying, quote, "The vote was never Black women's only strategy or goal. They constructed their political power with one eye on the polls and the other on organizing, lobbying, and institution building. They dreamed big about women's rights and aimed high, committed to using their power to win the dignity of all people." She notes that while they were willing to work alongside others in this goal, they were also willing and not afraid to forge their own paths. All the while, they maintained their mission of, quote, "winning women's power that would serve all humanity." And again, I want to underline that idea of all humanity. They weren't fighting just for themselves, but for everyone. So tonight we'll be taking a look at the Women's Era Club, a Boston-based Black women's club founded by Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin in the 1890s. The club and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin have often been described or remembered for their work in women's suffrage. Even the suffrage newspaper, the Woman's Journal, supported this belief as they described the woman of the Women's Era Club in a report in 1894, quote, "As these ladies are able and fearless advocates of women's suffrage, it may be expected that the Women's Era Club will take the lead in educational work for the movement among colored women." Yes, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin was a suffragist. She worked in leadership roles of local suffrage organizations. She collaborated with white local contemporaries, suffragist Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe. to advocate for suffrage in white and Black communities. And yes, the Women's Era Club participated in suffrage events. Members spoke on behalf of suffrage, and the Women's Era paper published articles and editorials in favor of suffrage, particularly encouraging African-American women to exercise their right to vote in school committee elections, something that they had won the right to do so in 1879. But I do want to make it clear that their work in activism should not be limited to that one specific goal. So if we consider historian Martha Jones' words about this broader goal and dive more deeply into this club and the woman behind this club, we can see what I consider to be a much more compelling story, one of activism and service. And as we discuss the work of the Women's Era Club and the stories of 3 Black women activists affiliated with this club, I hope that we can kind of keep this wider view in mind and really consider our understanding of activism. So as we kind of move forward, I'd like for you to consider, when you think of an activist, what are the words and phrases that originally come to your mind? What are those qualities and characteristics? And, what makes someone an activist? And keep those in mind throughout our time together, so then we can kind of consider what it means to be an activist in one's community and for one's community. So before we dive into some of the women behind this club, let's get to know a little bit about the club itself. So what was the Women's Era Club? Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin founded the Women's Era Club in 1893. Already an active clubwoman herself, Josephine was one of the few women of color attending a variety of majority white women's clubs. And from participating in these clubs, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin saw a need for a club that more greatly included African-American women and offered a place to discuss topics of interest to their gender and race. So from this need, Josephine and about 20 other women founded the Women's Era Club in March of 1893. And their club motto, as we see here, is, quote, "help to make the world better." And it derived from white suffragist Lucy Stone's believed last words. The account of the first meeting of the Women's Era Club kind of gives us a sense of the club's purpose and the agenda. Josephine Ruffin's daughter, Florida Ruffin Ridley, served as secretary of the club, and she read a report that highlighted the community's need for a club to be, quote, "started and led by colored women, because there are, quote, so many questions which, as colored women, we are called upon to answer." This report acknowledges the need for women to partake in activities for the betterment of the race and encourages women to come together and organize in order to do so. Florida Ridley ended her report with, quote, "It cannot but be admitted that we, as a race, have too frequently limited ourselves to this field, with the result of contracting our vision, enfeebling our impulses, and weakening our powers. We, the women of the Women's Era Club, enter the field to work hand in hand with women, generally for humanity and humanity's interests." In less than a year, the Women's Era Club grew to over 100 members from Greater Boston. Some white women also joined as members, and the club continued to maintain close ties with white suffragists and civic reformers throughout its existence. So the Women's Era Club held about 2 meetings a month. One was a normal club meeting, and one was a community talk or lecture on an interesting or relevant subject, and it was often for educational purposes. They discussed anything from civics, domestic science, literature, public improvements, and other issues that directly affected their local Black community. The Women's Era Club also held carnivals for charities and local institutions, particularly raising money for homes and hospitals in their local community. They also wrote and distributed information on discrimination and anti-lynching. They supported women's suffrage events, and they raised money for scholarships for Black young women aspiring for higher education. So in this way, the Women's Era Club primarily had a focus on 2 specific communities: the internal community of its members through intellectual engagement and self-improvement, as well as Boston's Black community through addressing social issues. But even though they had kind of those two primary communities, I would say all the while, everything they did, they kept in mind that their work would contribute to this larger general effort of benefiting all humanity. In 1894, Josephine and her daughter Florida launched the Woman's Era paper. They served as the primary editors with assistance from other club members. And while this voice really started from Boston, it soon became the leading Black club women's publication, with contributors and editors from across the United States, from Illinois, Washington, D.C., New York, even Colorado, Tennessee, and beyond that. So clubs would send in and contribute updates on their local activities, and editors provided sections on literature, health and beauty, news about different issues, including suffrage, anti-lynching, discrimination, education, politics. And so this publication really served as the trumpet through which Black women could present a public voice. Booker T. Washington argued the Woman's Era, quote, did more than any other single agency to nationalize the club idea among the colored women of the country. So from this background, we can kind of get a sense of how the Woman's Era Club and the Woman's Era publication provided both local and national platforms for Black women. So as we talk about the following three women, Mariah Baldwin, Eliza Gardner, and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, the Women's Era Club is kind of the recurring platform that ties their stories together. And the club served as really a stepping stone for each of them as they pursued their individual callings of activism. So we're going to start with Mariah Baldwin. Mariah Baldwin helped to found the Women's Era Club, and she served as its vice president in its early years. Born in Cambridge in 1856, Mariah grew up in a family that was connected to the Boston community of professional and educated Black activists. She maintained this position in this community for her entire life, forming both personal and working relationships with notable local and national Black leaders of the time, including W.B. Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter, Archibald Grimke, George and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, among others. Mariah trained in Boston as a teacher, first going down to Maryland actually to teach before returning to Cambridge in 1881 as a teacher in Cambridge public schools. Mariah Baldwin spent her life as an educator and is most commonly remembered as the principal and later headmaster of the Agassiz School in Cambridge, which has now been appropriately renamed the Mariah L. Baldwin School. And for this reason, Mariah Baldwin is often solely remembered as an incredible educator of the mostly white Cambridge community. W.E.B. Du Bois, while a little harsh, I would say, I think kind of correctly forecasts her memory by saying, quote, how strange a mockery of our democracy it is that most Americans are chiefly interested to know that her pupils were white Massachusetts school children. And kind of in my observations and understanding of how Mariah Baldwin can be remembered today, I tend to agree to a certain extent with W.B. Du Bois's statement. So if we follow his lead, though, and kind of move away from Mariah Baldwin's work from the Agassiz School to kind of her broader work in the community, we can gather more insight into how she saw activism and how she served her community. And so in order to do so, let's kind of dive into some primary sources. So as a young teacher in Cambridge, Mariah Baldwin hosted Harvard students for weekly discussions in her home on Prospect Street. She created this safe intellectual space for curiosity and inquiry. Boston lawyer William Lewis remembered, quote, my first recollection of her was at her home on Prospect Street, where at the reading class which she held there for students of her race in Harvard, she read Tennyson's In Memoriam. W.B. Du Bois, another notable attendee of these gatherings, called them, quote, a sort of salon, unnamed, unorganized, but palpitating with spirit. He remembered, quote, I was then in my hottest, narrowest, self-centered, confident period with only faint beginnings of doubt and revolt, Some things I knew definitely and argued with scathing, unsympathetic finality that scared some into silence. But Mariah Baldwin was always serene, just slightly mocking, refusing to be thundered or domineered into silence, and answering always in that low, rich voice, with questionings, with frank admission of uncertainty, which seemed to me then as exasperatingly weak. W.B. Du Bois goes on to say how he and others grew to love and respect Mariah Baldwin more and more through these meetings. Quote, "Yet she grew on us all. Her poise commanded greater and greater respect. Her courage, her splendid quiet courage astonished us. And so she came to larger life and accomplishment." So we can kind of get a sense from these meetings that Mariah Baldwin truly created a space of learning in her home for African Americans who were not welcome within the traditional spaces of the academy. And in this space, she really encouraged them to pursue their thoughts. And as we see from W.B. Du Bois, she continued to push them and to challenge them into growing into their better selves. It is with the Women's Era Club, though, that we see Mariah Baldwin gain a community of women with which she could really more actively engage and encourage education. And her support for education fits rather neatly with the club's perspective on self-improvement. And as we discussed earlier, the club held educational lectures and raised money for young Black women for scholarships. And as a member of club leadership, we can kind of make an educated guess that Mariah Baldwin actively supported and encouraged these aspects of the club. So this particular notice that we see here was from the Women's Era, and it speaks to an application process in which Mariah Baldwin plans to open up her home to a young student wanting to come to Boston to pursue a college education. And we see this notice states, quote, "Miss Baldwin would so use her influence that nothing need stand in the way of her protege's intellectual advancement, not even the doors of Radcliffe College." So we see this example here. This is a direct example, really, of Mariah Baldwin using the organ of the Women's Era, as well as the club itself, to help other Black women seek intellectual advancement, and in this case, through her offering her own services as a mentor. So in some cases, Mariah Baldwin used her status as an educator to actually reach out into largely white audiences, bringing awareness to African American issues. She was often welcome to speak in front of largely white clubs for lectures, such as the Catabrigia Club in Cambridge and the New England Women's Club. And in this example we see here, Mariah Baldwin spoke in front of the Women's Alliance of Roslindale Church in January of 1912, where she discussed issues facing African Americans in the South. And this article, which was published in the Cambridge Tribune, talks about Mariah Baldwin shedding light on the causes of, quote, the Negro problem, and that many problems the African American community faces is due to discrimination and injustice. Mariah Baldwin called out the responsibility of white communities in these causes, stating, quote, "The race is rich in possibilities if prejudice does not blind the white man to justice and fair play." And we see here how Mariah Baldwin uses her position and her training as an educator to challenge this particular white audience to recognize their own complicity in challenges African Americans face. And we saw that in this time and time again in other newspaper clippings of different events that she attended, that she took this similar approach of challenging white audiences that she spoke in front of. And in speaking with white audiences, Mariah Baldwin not only drew attention to specific issues, but she also represented the Black community by serving as an example of a highly successful, educated Black woman. Mariah Baldwin was asked to present a speech at the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences in 1897, an honor which was noted at the time for being only given to those of highest merit. Writer Pauline Hopkins recalled in 1902, quote, "The entire colored population was happily surprised and greatly cheered when it was announced that she was chosen to deliver the address on Harriet Beecher Stowe before the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences. Mariah Baldwin became the first African-American woman to give this address. And we see this article in the Woman's Era praising Mariah Baldwin for being an exceptional example for her race, saying, quote, "We know of no one better fitted by intellectual and spiritual insight and by the power and grace of expression to deliver this address." Over 20 years after her death, another well-known educator, Mary McLeod Bethune, called Mariah Baldwin, quote, "among our bright beacons," in the Chicago Defender. And her portrait of Mariah Baldwin's life supports this notion of activism through education. Mary McLeod Bethune recognized how Mariah Baldwin, quote, "acquired great stature in the field of education, as the warmth of her personality melted those subtle barriers felt by Negroes in many areas where no segregation laws exist. And how, quote, even on the lecture platform where she later attained great distinction, Mariah Baldwin was always the teacher, understanding, persuasive, and challenging." So as a lifelong educator, Mariah Baldwin believed in encouraging higher learning among the Black community, as well as educating white audiences and communities on behalf of her race, serving as an example to combat prejudice and break down stereotypes. From actions taken throughout her life, we see that Mariah Baldwin saw education as a way of raising up her community, making positive change, and enlightening the minds of others. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Eliza and Gardner. So while serving her community, Eliza Gardner exercised her activism in her strengths as an orator and as a respected religious figure. Born in New York in 1831, her family moved to Boston during her childhood, and she grew up in the abolitionist West End community. Her family home was a station on the Underground Railroad, and she attended the African-American Abiel Smith School in Beacon Hill. In her youth, Eliza Gardner became acquainted with the local and national abolitionists of William Lloyd Garrison, Lewis Hayden, John Brown, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman, among others. So this early exposure ignited within her the drive to speak out for causes she so readily supported. Her abolitionist upbringing was also a religious one, as Eliza Gardner became an active member of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Boston. Known as someone, quote, "pointed and convincing in speech, winning in manner, and overpowering in appeal," Eliza Gardner spoke out against injustice, whether her religious community's treatment of women or the discrimination and terrorism against African Americans in the United States. So before her involvement with the Women's Era Club, Eliza Gardner engaged in activism within her religious community. Eliza was an influential leader in the New England AME Zion Church. She served in the Daughters of Conference, which raised money to support ministers and erect churches. And she supported equality for women in religious institutions. She sought leadership positions herself within the church hierarchy and fought for female ordination. So through this support for expanding women's rights within the church institution, Eliza Gardner is considered the mother of the AME Zion Women's Home and Foreign Missionary Society, which was a woman-run organization within the church that supported missionaries. So she recognized the reluctance of male church leaders to support this and other woman-led church organizations. So Eliza Gardner spoke out against AME Zion's treatment of women, particularly in the 1884 General Conference. As we can see with these selections of the quote, she often referenced the believed history of liberty and equality in the Massachusetts tradition as she argued for greater respect and value for women in the AME Zion Church. She said, quote, "I come from old Massachusetts, where we have declared that all, not only men, but women too, are created free and equal with certain inalienable rights which men are bound to respect. And if you commence to talk about the superiority of men, if you persist in telling us that after the fall of man, we were put under your feet and that we are intended to be subject to your will, we cannot help you in New England one bit. Eliza Gardner continued to be an outspoken and active member in the AME Zion Church throughout her life, though in her later life, we see her become more politically engaged in the Boston community. And it wasn't uncommon for African-American religious leaders to address social justice issues, as there is a long tradition of religious spaces serving as meeting places for social and political activism. If we look at antebellum Boston alone, many religious institutions served as centers for the anti-slavery movement. These spaces also held discussions on social issues, such as equal education, racism, and the political means needed to address these issues. In addition to being places of religious guidance and teaching, Black churches brought together the community to talk about civil rights issues. And it truly seems that Eliza Gardner appears to fit within this tradition of moral political leadership coming from religious institutions. So as a founding member of the Women's Era Club, this club appears to be a place where Eliza Gardner most successfully blended her standing as a religious leader with her political and social beliefs, serving as a spiritual advisor while also tackling issues that affected her community. Her anti-lynching activism through the Women's Era Club appeared most prominently, which we see from these clippings. So in May of 1894, women of the Women's Era Club met with local political leaders to discuss how to address the lynching crisis that currently terrorized African Americans in primarily the south of the southern United States. And the first committee formed included notable local Black activists of Emory Morris, Butler Wilson, and Clement Morgan, as well as club members Eliza Gardner and Agnes Adams, as well as some club secretaries. There was a second meeting held at Eliza Gardner's home, in which additional members of the Women's Era Club joined, including Florida Ridley and Josephine Ruffin. So this meeting resulted in the formation of several committees that became in charge, each of them in charge of different tactics to address the anti-lynching or the lynching crisis and bringing awareness to it. This included by writing petitions, speaking with clergy members, involving and attracting press attention, and even just generally trying to educate the public on this. And unfortunately, I have not located any records on the specific results or actions of this organization and these committees. But from these clippings, we can still glean that Eliza Gardner was an active participant and organizer, as well as a supporter of bringing awareness to the lynching crisis to the Boston community, and really in determining ways and taking action of how she and other Bostonians could address it. So in her later years, we kind of have the most evidence to support kind of her political involvement in the local community, especially addressing social justice issues. So even though her community or her audience still really remained primarily local, she continued to raise awareness and draw attention to racial injustice. And in newspaper clippings, we see that Eliza Gardner publicly spoke out against lynching and all forms of discrimination against African Americans, both in the South and around her. And what I find most interesting, as I've come across different newspaper articles, is that we see that Eliza Gardner publicly spoke out. When she spoke out, is that she was echoing her abolitionist roots, commonly speaking and presiding over events that remembered abolitionists and Civil War veterans. So we see here that during an event honoring the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, Eliza Gardner, considered over 80 years old, no less, connected her memories of abolition and Civil War to the current treatment of African Americans throughout the United States, saying, quote, "The North," she said, "met with defeat in the Civil War until it called on the Black man. And yet after all the sacrifices of our race, he is not considered worthy of this companionship of the whites. Yet as there was no victory without us in the past, so there will be none without us in the future." And if we look at the date of this article, of this event being in 1917 during the First World War, so we see multi-layers here of how Eliza Gardner is connecting the past with the present and also making a larger point to argue that as long as discrimination and injustice persist, the United States will never fully prevail, will never fully, obtain its, full goals. So Eliza Gardner was truly both a religious and political orator, exemplifying the tradition of political and social activism within Black churches. She made significant strides for women within the AME Zion Church before transitioning into becoming a more public activist. The Women's Era Club allowed her to use both her oratory skills and status as a respected religious figure in Boston's Black community to become a voice for political and social issues that affected African Americans throughout the United States. Finally, we're going to be talking about Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. So as the founder and the leader of the Women's Era Club, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin saw her role as an activist really on a larger scale than either Eliza Gardner or Mariah Baldwin. And as we mentioned earlier, Josephine successfully launched a club for the African-American women of Greater Boston, as well as a nationally recognized publication, filling two desperate needs for both the Boston and national communities. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin aspired to have a leading role in the national club movement for Black women. And since we have the most information on Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, she is the most malleable, I would say, of activists of these three women. And we don't have time to cover everything about her tonight, so I've just chosen to focus on two significant events that offer insight into what I believe are major moments in her activism. As I said, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin had a vision for organizing Black women on a national scale. And it's clear from very early editions of the Women's Era that forming this publication was not enough for her. Representing a national assortment of voices was one challenge, but bringing these voices together in one place to create a united front was an entirely different challenge. And Josephine took on this challenge, deciding to organize a national convention for Black women. In one of the first publications of the Women's Era, Josephine sent out a call to Black clubwomen to share their thoughts on the notion of having such an event. She made her argument saying that, quote, organization or military advance is the first step in nation making, the first step in any progressive movement. She goes on to call for a Congress to quote, give solidity, unity of purpose, national character, and other requisites of success necessary to a movement so broad and far-reaching as a race organization should be. So here we see this language of organizing, this desire to form a single united movement of Black women. And in a later editorial, Josephine Ruffin wrote, quote, we want this organization to be representative and national. We must avoid being either precipitate or careless. Our convention must be the whole-souled expression of our earnest women of all sections and must be backed by all our women. Let us agitate and prepare. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin put forward this clear call to action to energize her fellow clubwomen for this national cause. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, along with members of the Women's Era Club, planned for a convention in July of 1895 in Boston. Josephine Ruffin took the role as president of the convention, with her daughter Florida Ridley serving as corresponding secretary. Mariah Baldwin served as chair of the executive board, and Eliza Gardner presided as the chaplain of the conference. And several other members of the club participated as well. And looking at this poster here, we see Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Eliza Gardner, and Florida Ridley, as well as another Women's Era Club member, Hannah Smith, who served as executive secretary. And in her welcome address, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin voiced her call to arms, saying, quote, our women's movement is a women's movement in that it is led and directed by women, for the good of women and men, for the benefit of all humanity, which is more than any one branch or section of it. We ask the active interest of our men, and two, we are not drawing the color line. We are women, American women, as intensely interested in all that pertains to us as such as all other American women. We are not alienating or withdrawing. We are only coming to the front, willing to join any others in the same work and cordially inviting and welcoming any others to join us. The actions of the conference led to the formation of the National Federation of Afro-American Women, with Mrs. Mary Washington as president. The purpose of the National Federation was to concentrate the energies of African-American clubwomen into, quote, one broad band of sisterhood for taking on needed reforms for, quote, the upbuilding, ennobling, and advancement of the race. This became a leading organization for African-American clubwomen in the United States and served as a precursor to the National Association of Colored Women, established a year later in 1896, which later changed its name to the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, as it's now known today. While Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin did not take a official leadership role in the National Federation of Afro-American Women, nor really in the later national organizations, she had really steered this ship to organizing and congregating Black women from around the country. Josephine was primarily responsible for the Boston Convention, during which the light sparked to form a national alliance of Black women's clubs and create a unified voice of Black club women. So while Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin worked to create this national framework for Black women's clubs, she still felt that Black women had a place and deserved a place in a white women's club organizing as well. At the local and regional level, it appears that Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin successfully obtained some level of inclusion for African-American clubwomen. This possibly could have been due to Josephine's status among clubwomen in Boston, as the Women's Era Club was largely accepted and supported by local, predominantly white women's clubs. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin also served as a co-founder of the Massachusetts State Federation of Women's Clubs, which, as her daughter Florida recognized, quote, this puts her not only as a pioneer in colored club work, but also as a pioneer in white club work. On the national level, however, her desire for representation and inclusion hit more barriers. In 1900, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin traveled as part of the Massachusetts delegation to Milwaukee for the General Federation of Women's Clubs, and she did so as a representative of the Women's Era Club. She had already sent in club dues for the Women's Era Club, which the Federation had accepted without knowing that it was a Black women's club. This led to a confrontation when Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin was barred from participating as a member of a Black club. The Federation tried to return the dues, which Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin refused to accept. This confrontation resulted in her leaving the meeting, for she refused to attend the meeting as anything other than the representative of the Women's Era Club. And president of the Federation, Rebecca Lowe from Georgia, said of Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, quote, Mrs. Ruffin belongs among her own people. Among them, she would be a leader and could do much good, but among us, she can create only trouble. After returning to Boston, Josephine presented her account to the Women's Era Club, and she recounted how she was refused recognition because she represented a Black women's club, and representatives would not let her take to the floor as a result. In return, the Women's Era Club voiced its support for her actions, which we see in this resolution excerpted from a Boston Globe article. The Women's Era Club furthermore released a statement in November of later that year saying, quote, the General Federation of Women's Clubs has no color line in its constitution. The Women's Era Club having been regularly admitted, no legal or moral ground can possibly be found upon which it could be ruthlessly thrown out at the pleasure of a few individuals. Even in the face of discrimination, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin held her ground and continued to push for the representation of her club and generally Black women's clubs in the larger women's clubs movement. This confrontation highlighted what would be a divisive issue for the women's club movement in the following years of whether or not to include Black women's clubs, which we also see reflected in the issues in the suffrage movement as well, happening at the same time. So as I said, these are just two examples of Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin's activism. As a leader of the Women's Era Club, she used her position to promote the organization of Black women's clubs nationally, and she believed in a need for Black women from across the United States to create a united network that would encourage self-improvement and activism for causes that affected specifically the Black community, but also everyone involved. While recognizing this need to organize among Black women, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin also fought for the inclusion of Black women in the white women's club movement. Successful at this task on some levels, she faced obstacles at the national level. And in both instances, Josephine used organizing and inclusion as ways to ensure that her community's voice would be represented on a national scale. So now that we've learned a little bit more about these women and how they became activists for their communities, let's kind of reflect on the questions that I posed at the beginning of this talk of what it means to be an activist. You know, have these examples maybe changed or broadened your definition of an activist, or maybe even your understanding of what activism could look like? Mariah Baldwin, Eliza Gardner, and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin are only representatives of the many Black Bostonian women members of the Women's Era Club who use their skills and their talents to become activists on behalf of their race and gender. While these women served their communities before, during, and after their time with the Women's Era Club, the club created a space for self-improvement, discussion, and activism for Black women at the turn of the century. Each remarkable woman that I spoke about today used the Women's Era Club as a vehicle through which they could activate their skills and better both themselves and their defined communities. Mariah, Eliza, and Josephine represent a generation of often unsung and overlooked Black women's activists at the turn of the century. They were more than just suffragists. They embodied the goals of historian Martha Jones outlined of reaching for a broader vision of racial and gender equality that would benefit everyone. Inspiring the next generation of activists of the 20th century, they remembered the past while also looking to the future with the hope of progress. They should be elevated as an example of the longstanding tradition of Black women who start and lead national movements, organizing and agitating because they have wide-reaching views of equality and justice. So I hope I've kind of shown through the activities of these women that there is no one way to be an activist. These three women had their own passions, their own strengths, their own visions. They all found ways to help their defined communities using their own gifts. Mariah Baldwin's belief in education, Eliza Gardner's powerful oratory and her religious upbringing, and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin's organizing of a national movement. They each found ways to push the boundaries and ensure the voices of their communities would be heard. So let's end by thinking about and considering our own strengths and passions, our own visions for the future, and what we can do to serve our communities. So I'll end with that. Before we go to questions, I do just want to kind of do a shout out to some National Parks of Boston's programming that's coming up this March. We have quite a bit on slate for this month. So we have some coming up this week with the Lives of Monuments Bunker Hill. We also have our BPL talks for the rest of the month. And I would just suggest to check out Boston National Historical Park's calendar for more information. So with that, I will stop sharing and we can go if there are any questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Katie. That was a wonderful presentation. Right now, we actually don't have a question in the chat, so I do want to give people a moment if they do have any questions to type something in. So I was hoping if maybe you could speak a little bit, and I think you did a good job with Eliza Gardner, but I'm a little bit curious if you found within the the women that you mentioned and other women maybe in the women's era club, how much inspiration that they found within like the anti-slavery struggle, and how maybe that would have been a place that not only did they find inspiration, but they may have kind of learn different ways of being an activist. So do you have anything that you might be able to speak to that a little bit? And if anybody has any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it, these three women grew up in Boston's Beacon Hill community. So they grew up being surrounded by, the early anti-slavery and abolitionist leaders of the community. And so I think being in that space really probably informed them on how they were going to pursue their activism later in life. I mean, even Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin was actively involved early on before the Civil War, and she actually helped recruit for the Massachusetts 54th Regiment as well. So I think a lot of this was probably their interactions with each other. They, them coming into the same spaces as these abolitionists, anti-slavery activists. And I think there is a long tradition of, looking to Mariah Stewart in the 1830s and her speaking out on behalf of the Black community and even specifically Black women. So I think there really was a deep sense of history and of carrying on the tradition beyond anti-slavery and abolition and into the turn of the century as well.
Awesome. Yeah, no, those connections are very powerful. So we do have a question in the chat, and the question is, did you say her work helped bring about the NAACP? And I'm wondering if that's related specifically to Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin.
Yeah, so Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, she helped the 1895 convention helped with the formation of the National Association of Colored Women. So that was specifically a women's organization, which became the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. But Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin was also in on the ground floor of the NAACP as well. And I believe even Mariah Baldwin might have been involved as well as Josephine's daughter, Florida Ridley. So they were all still actively involved in those early movements in the early 1900s and kind of the club building as we see in the early 20th century.
Great. So it doesn't look like we have any additional questions.
I did such a great job. They don't have questions.
I think you answered everything that could have been presented. No, you did a great job, Katie. I think speaking on behalf of everybody. And I'd like to turn it back over to Karen. The floor is yours.
Katie, you did great. Honestly, I was like, wow, I'm learning so much. This is so wonderful. Thank you so much for that amazing and very informative presentation. Actually, I learned a lot. This is why I really enjoy these programs. Thank you so much. This was great. Yeah, and you already did the most amazing job, which is telling people about our next one, which is March 16th is the next one that's happening. One of the National Park Service presents. That is the next one that's happening here for the BPL. And we have another one on, I believe the last Tuesday of the month as well, because there are 5 Tuesdays in March because we love women's history, guys. Anyway, thank you so much to everyone who's coming. And if you have a question, you can always email ask@bpl.org. I can pass it along to our wonderful Rangers. And also, if you are interested in doing your own research, you can always get a library electronic card. We call it an e-card. So if you go to bpl.org, you can get a BPL e-card, and you can actually access any of our wonderful electronic resources from home, including Ancestry, as the pandemic is going on, and you can continue the research that Katie has done. Alrighty, thank you so much, and we will see you in a few weeks. Have a great day.